So, we're going to be studying Habakkuk today, if you don't already know that. So if you want to turn over there. We'll actually go to a couple places in Kings and Chronicles before that. So if you want to turn over in that area, that would be great too. So I wanted to start out by just giving, my goal today is to get through chapter 1 only. There's 3 chapters in Habakkuk. So if we can get through chapter 1, that would be great, because then we have Wednesday to cover the last 2 chapters. But that's also because we want to cover a lot of the background and introductory material. So I'm going to have you guys tell me, if you were able to do the reading, that would be great. Who can tell me who the author is of Habakkuk? It's not too hard one.
Habakkuk.
Right. And does anybody know, we don't know for sure, but anybody get what his name means? Possibly.
Embrace, or one who embraces.
Right. And then, can anybody tell me what some of his contemporaries would be? Like some other prophets during about the same time. Got a couple different ones on there.
Jeremiah.
Mm-hmm. Jeremiah. Ezekiel would be towards that later part of it. Yep. So Nahum and Zephaniah would also kind of be in the same time frame. So it's right around here, a little bit before Judah falls. We're probably looking right in this general area, if that'll right. Is about where Habakkuk falls. So yeah, Nahum, Zephaniah, Jeremiah. I'll just put the general abbreviations up here. I'm not going to write out the whole name. And then probably, very likely knew a young Daniel, young Ezekiel, because they were going into that first wave or second wave of captivity into Babylon. Who else did I say? Jeremiah. Okay, and so what nation did Habakkuk prophesy to, or what nation was he involved with? It's kind of a different question for Habakkuk than the rest of the minor prophets.
Well, Judah, because Israel's already taken.
Right, so Judah, because Israel already went into captivity in 722. So we're quite a ways past that. So, yes, Habakkuk was a prophet of Yahweh, of course, living shortly before the Babylonian invasion. His country could only be Judah, since the northern kingdom had fallen in 722, which was long before his lifetime. And some other biblical texts like Daniel, 2 Kings, Chronicles, they kind of show the Babylonian invasion of Judah as predicted by Habakkuk and several other prophets. So as far as the date of Habakkuk, we're looking at late 7th century to early 6th century. It's probably going to be late 7th century. So the dates I had specifically, this is as accurate as I could get. It might be a little bit broader of a range, but it's around the time of 609 to 605. So 609 to 605 BC. That should be on the handout too if anybody's coming in. There's handouts up out here at the front if you want to grab one of those. So the tone of Habakkuk, as we're about to get into, it suggests that Babylonian invasion is imminent. It's coming. It's right on the doorstep. And so as far as the date is concerned, some of the other kings and things that have been going on in Judah specifically, because that's the nation that Habakkuk is with, the reign of Manasseh would be too early. So Manasseh reigned from 697 to 642. So that's going to be too early for Habakkuk to be really prophesying during that time. And a good indicator, a good date or event that happened that can help us remember when Habakkuk happens, is the death of Josiah. And we're going to get into, I've got a map I'm going to pull up in a second so we can see what's really going on behind the scenes, what's really going on that kind of leads to what Habakkuk is talking about. But the death of Josiah is one of those key events that it happens in 609 BC, and he is Judah's last good king, Josiah. So that's one of the key events that really keys us into, this is about when Habakkuk is prophesying, when his oracle happens. So Josiah's son Jehoahaz reigns for about 3 months in 609, is really too brief to be the main focus of Habakkuk's oracle, and that's in 2 Kings chapter 23. But the conditions described in Habakkuk 1, verses 2 through 4, really fit the reign of Jehoiakim, which is the oldest son of Josiah. And we're going to read from there in just a second if you want to turn over to 2 Kings 23. We'll be there briefly. But Habakkuk's early prophecies mention this Babylonian invasion as a future event. So it hasn't happened yet. So the first wave of captivity, there's 3 different waves, happens about 605. So we know it's between 609 and 605, about in that time frame, from when Josiah dies to when the first captives are taken into Babylon. So as far as the background and setting, here's when we're going to get into some of this map and stuff in just a moment. We already mentioned how Manasseh was reigning in Judah for about 55 years, from 697 to 642 BC. And this is helpful setup because we kind of get to understand not just like what's happening right immediately when Habakkuk is prophesying, but kind of what's leading up to it. So if you look at 2 Kings 21, 2 Kings 21. And can I get somebody to read nice and loud verses 1 through 18? 2 Kings 21, verses 1 through 18.
Right here. 2 Kings 21. I'm sorry, the verses again.
1 through 18.
Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king, and he reigned 55 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Hephzibah. He did evil in the sight of the Lord, according to the abominations of the nations, whom the Lord dispossessed before the sons of Israel. For he rebuilt the high places which Hezekiah his father had destroyed, and he erected altars for Baal, and made an Asherah, as Ahab king of Israel had done, and worshipped all the host of heaven and served them. He built altars in the house of the Lord, of which the Lord had said, In Jerusalem I will put my name. For he built altars for all the host of heaven in the 2 courts of the house of the Lord. He made his son pass through the fire, practiced witchcraft and used divination, and dealt with mediums and spiritists. He did much evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. Then he set the carved image of Asherah, as he had made, in the house of which the Lord said to David and to his son Solomon, In this house and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen from all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever. And I will not make the feet of Israel wander any more from the land which I give their fathers, if only they will observe and do according to all that I have commanded them, and according to all of the law that my servant Moses commanded. But they did not listen, and Manasseh seduced them to do evil more than the nations which the Lord had destroyed before the sons of Israel. Now the Lord spoke through his servants the prophets, saying, Because Manasseh the king of Judah has done these abominations, having done wickedly more than all of the Amorites did who were before him, and who has also made Judah sin with his idols. Therefore thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, Behold, I am bringing such calamity on Jerusalem and Judah, that whoever hears of it, both his ears will tingle. I will stretch over Jerusalem the line of Samaria, and plummet the house of Ahab. And I will wipe Jerusalem as one wipes a dish, wiping it and turning it upside down. I will abandon the remnant of my inheritance and deliver them into the hands of their enemies, and they will become as plunder and spoil to all their enemies, because they have done evil in my sight, and have been provoking me to anger since the day their fathers came from Egypt, even to this day. Moreover, Manasseh shed very much innocent blood until he had filled Jerusalem from one end to another, besides his sin with which he made Judah sin in doing evil in the sight of the Lord. Now the rest of the acts of Manasseh and all that he did, and his sin which he committed, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? And Manasseh slept with his fathers and was buried in the garden of his own house, in the garden of Uzzah. And Amon his son became king in his place.
Okay. So from what we know from some of the other prophets we've studied and as we're going into Habakkuk, from that reading specifically, what stands out to you? What stands out to you about Manasseh? Like what would characterize him as a king of Judah?
It's very evil, very corrupt.
Mm-hmm.
He completely reversed everything Hezekiah had done.
Right. who was the last good king besides Josiah before him. So it's pretty doubtful that really at any period in Judah's history that there was a worse king than Manasseh. I mean, he was about as bad as it gets. Ahab in Israel would be a similar to comparison. He was really, really bad. I mean, some of the things he did, he rebuilt the high places. He reared altars to Baal and Ashtoreth. He built altars to all the hosts of heaven. He made his sons, he sacrificed his sons, making them pass through the fire. Used all these different kinds of divination and sorcery and things that were forbidden in the law. And then he just, that last characterization there, in one of the last couple of verses we read about him filling Israel and Jerusalem with bloodshed, with innocent blood. So Manasseh is just very, very bad. And this is part of what brings us to Habakkuk. This is kind of the start of like, Judah was doing well with Hezekiah, but then they really start to go down the hill. So later, Manasseh, of course, kind of humbles himself. He tries to correct his wickedness, but doesn't really have any success with that. So then we have his son Ammon, at that last verse that Ben read for us. His son Ammon reigns in his place. And there's not really much difference there. If you'll turn over to 2 Chronicles 33, 2 Chronicles 33, it's about the same thing. His reign is kind of characterized by his father. If somebody could read 2 Chronicles 33, verses 21 through 25. Nice and loud.
Oh, I got it. You said 21
Through 25.
Okay. Ammon was 22 years old when he became king, and he reigned 2 years in Jerusalem. But he did evil in the sight of the Lord, as his father Manasseh had done. For Ammon sacrificed to all the carved images which his father Manasseh had made, and served them. And he did not humble himself before the Lord, as his father Manasseh had humbled himself. But Ammon trespassed more and more. Then his servants conspired against him and killed him in his own house. But the people of the land executed all those who had conspired against King Ammon. And the people of the land made his son Josiah king in his place.
Okay, so again, just like Manasseh, his father, King Ammon was a very bad king as well. Didn't reign for nearly as long, only 2 years, but 2 bad kings in a row. Then we come to Josiah, who's the son of Ammon. Look at 2 Chronicles, just continuing there, 34 and verse. Can someone read verses 1 through 7?
Josiah was 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned 31 years in Jerusalem. And he did what was right in the sight of the Lord, and walked in the ways of his father David. He did not turn aside to the right hand or to the left. For in the 8th year of his reign, while he was still young, he began to seek the God of his father David. And in the 12th year, he began to purge Judah and Jerusalem of the high places, the wooden images, the carved images, and the molded images. They broke down the altars of the Baals in his presence, and the incense altars which were above them he cut down. And the wooden images, the carved images, and the molded images he broke in pieces, and made dust of them, and scattered it on the graves of those who had sacrificed to them. He also burned the bones of the priests on their altars, and cleansed Judah and Jerusalem. So he did in the cities of Manasseh, Ephraim, and Simeon, as far as Naphtali and all around, with axes. When he had broken down the altars and the wooden images, had beaten the carved images into powder, and cut down all the incense altars throughout all the land of Israel, he returned to Jerusalem.
Okay, so what characterizes Josiah? Well, we already talked about what characterizes Manasseh and Ammon, but how is Josiah different?
Returning to right.
What are some of the specific things that we just read that he did?
Well, he's very bold. He didn't seem to hesitate at all. It wasn't like he was lukewarm. He was very intent on his
Right.
purpose.
He was trying to eradicate a lot of the idolatry, the altars.
He went above and beyond. He went outside of his territory to remove the altars.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And those high places that continue to keep cropping up, he took those down as well, so.
Right. And so something that you can notice for both Israel and Judah, I mean, it's going to be more so for Judah because all of Israel's kings were bad. But for Judah, every king is compared to some king that went before them, either a good king or a bad king. And so Josiah here is compared to David. He's a good king. It says that he sought after God just like David did. And so he purged Judah of the high places, the Asherim, the carved-in metal images, and even like some of these weird kind of obscure things of burning the bones of the priests that sacrificed at these altars and worshipped at these altars. He burned their bones on the altars that they worshipped at and that they were overseeing. We're not going to read the next several verses, 8 through 21, but basically this is when the book of the law is found. So Josiah, one of his servants comes, I can't remember the name of the servant, but he comes to him and he tells him, we found the book of the law. So the book of the law is found, and then in verses 22 it says, so Hilkiah and those whom the king had sent went to Huldah the prophetess, the wife of Shallum, the son of Tokath, son of Heshrah, keeper of the wardrobe. Now she lived in Jerusalem in the second quarter, and spoke to her to that effect. And she said to them, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, tell the man who sent you to me, thus says the Lord, behold, I will bring disaster upon this place and upon its inhabitants, all the curses that are written in the book that was read before the king of Judah. Because they have forsaken me, and have made offerings to other gods, that they might provoke me to anger with all the works of their hands. Therefore my wrath will be poured out on this place, and will not be quenched. But to the king of Judah, who sent you to inquire of the Lord, thus you shall say to him, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, regarding the words that you have heard, because your heart was tender, and you humbled yourself before God, when you heard his words against this place and its inhabitants, and you've humbled yourself before me, and have torn your clothes and wept before me, I also have heard you, declares the Lord. Behold, I will gather you to your fathers, and you shall be gathered to your grave in peace. And your eyes shall not see all the disaster that I will bring upon this place and its inhabitants. And they brought back word to the king. We'll stop there. So Josiah sends for Huldah the prophetess. And just kind of on a side note, I'm not really sure why he didn't send for Nahum, Zephaniah, Jeremiah, like Habakkuk. Not sure exactly why he didn't send for them. We don't really have an answer to that. That's just an interesting thing to think about. But so he sends for Huldah the prophetess, and she prophesies disaster on Judah. Well, what is that disaster going to come from that we're about to get to? Babylon. So, but it's not going to happen during Josiah's lifetime. He's going to be spared because he was good, and he followed God, and he kept his law. We're also not going to read the rest of chapter 34, where basically they read the book of the law to all the people, and they keep the Passover with enthusiasm, basically like never has been before in Judah in chapter 35. But Josiah is this last good king in Judah. So this is all kind of leading up. So we had Manasseh and Ammon, both really bad kings. Then we get Josiah. It's kind of like a sprinkle of hope in there. There's some good. And then after Josiah dies, there's just really nothing good left from there. So we've got Judah in here, and we've got Assyria up towards the north, who's been the power. They're the ones who took Israel into captivity, 722. But then we have Babylon down here that starts to become the power after them. So we've had Assyrian dominance so far, and let's see if I can get this. There we go. So I couldn't find a better map than this, but this kind of has some of the dates down here. I don't know if you can see this, but Ashurbanipal is the last king of this Assyrian empire who reigns up until, it says here, 627. I had somewhere around that for 625, I think is what I had for like his last, or 633 was like the last year or so that he was reigning, somewhere in that time, or coming right up to when Habakkuk is prophesying. But you can kind of see this is the same like area. So Egypt's down here, Judah, and then Assyria has like all of this. At least at one point in time, they've ruled over all of this. So they've been the world power by far for a long time. And then we come back to this map, we get to Assyria has been in power the whole time, from the time of Isaiah and Micah, which we've talked a little bit about, up until this time of Zephaniah, Nahum, Habakkuk. Assyria was in power. And there was like a lot of revolts. People would try to break free of their power, but Assyria just kind of stayed in that place. Well, in 633, you can see on your handout one of those dates, 633 BC, Ashurbanipal, the last like great king of this Assyrian empire, dies. And so upon his death, Assyria really begins to decline, to disintegrate. And so in 625, Nabopolassar, the king of Babylon, declares independence of Babylon from Assyria, which leads for them to start having a war, essentially. So Babylon and Nineveh, Babylon and Assyria, get in conflict over that because there's kind of a shift in the power. And so in 614, the Medes come from that east. They come over, which they're just not listed on this map, but that's about where they're from. And they come and capture this capital city of Ashur, which is one of the main Assyrian cities. And Nebuchadnezzar, the son of Nabopolassar, one of the kings that we're more familiar with from Daniel and some of the other prophets, he comes up, and he's a son of Nabopolassar, who is the king of Babylon at this time, and he's also the general of his army. He leads an attack against Nineveh, so he comes up against Nineveh in 612 BC. And go back one. And the Medes come over and help them take that city out. So after destroying Nineveh, the remnant of the Assyrian army flees. So they're here, they flee over to a city, an area called Haran. So Haran is where Nebuchadnezzar pursues them to. So he reorganizes his forces and follows them to Haran, where he destroys the rest of them in 609 BC. You can see that on your handout as well. So he destroys really the remaining forces of Assyrian power. So they've just been getting weaker and weaker, chasing them up here, all the way over. They're just diminishing all their forces, all the way back to kind of where they're from, which was more like this area, but just really diminishing all their forces. And so in 609 BC, that is where Nebuchadnezzar really destroys them. And so after destroying Nineveh, Nebuchadnezzar reorganizes his forces and follows them to Haran, where he attacks and destroys the remaining forces of Assyrian power in 609 BC. I can't remember what that circle's for. That's where Haran is. I think this is Carchemish, but I forgot to label them, so that's my fault. So when this happens, it's really the last trace of Assyrian supremacy. Assyrian power is gone, which leaves the Chaldeans, Babylon, to come up and they are the new ones in power. They're the big dogs now. They're undisputed in this whole area. They just have all the power now. And so, like I said, Nebuchadnezzar, they destroy Nineveh, and they chase them up to Haran. Well, Pharaoh Necho, down in Egypt, decides he's going to come up and help Assyria at Haran. So he's going to come up and help Assyria at Haran, but, and we're going to look at some of these passages to show us what some of this is history, like there doesn't necessarily a passage connected with it. That's why I'm going through some of it with the map so we can understand what's going on. They chase them up, and then Pharaoh Necho is going to come up and help Assyria against Babylon. Well, Josiah, the last good king of Judah, decides that he doesn't want that to happen. So he determines that here, somewhere in this area, it's a little north of Jerusalem, at Megiddo, if you recognize that name, Josiah says, we're going to stop Pharaoh Necho from coming to help Assyria at Megiddo. And if you don't know the context, that's actually where Josiah dies, in 609 BC. True. Let's go back one. So Josiah dies here at Megiddo, actually in 2 Chronicles 35, the last part of it, in verse 20. It says, after all this, when Josiah had prepared the temple, Necho, king of Egypt, went up to fight at Carchemish on the Euphrates. Carchemish is up here. He went up to fight at Carchemish, and Josiah went out to meet him. But he sent envoys to him, saying, what have we to do with each other, king of Judah? I am not coming against you this day, but against the house with which I am at war. That would be Babylon. I'm coming against the house with which I'm at war. And God has commanded me to hurry. Cease opposing God, who is with me, lest he destroy you. Nevertheless, Josiah did not turn away from him, but disguised himself in order to fight with him. He did not listen to the words of Necho from the mouth of God, but came to fight in the plain of Megiddo. And the archers shot King Josiah, and the king said to his servants, "Take me away, for I am badly wounded." So his servants took him out of the chariot and carried him in the second chariot and brought him to Jerusalem. And he died and was buried in the tombs of his fathers. All Judah and Jerusalem mourned for Josiah. So here's a really interesting context for what's going on here. We have Pharaoh Necho coming up to help Assyria. Why is he doing that? Well, from here in 2 Chronicles, it's because apparently God told him to do that. And there's a connection between this and Habakkuk, because one of the ideas and themes that we see repeated in Habakkuk is God's use of the nations. So this is something we kind of want to remember, is that God, from all appearances, God sent Pharaoh Necho up to help them. And Pharaoh Necho even tells Josiah that. He says, "Why are you trying to stop me? God's the one sending me. Why are you opposing God?" It could just be Pharaoh Necho saying that, but from the text it says, "From the mouth of God." So in all appearances, it looks like God is the one sending him up there, and Josiah, on his own determination, decides that he's going to stop him at Megiddo and loses his life there. So then, essentially, what we're more familiar with is Babylon, after the defeat up here in Haran and Carchemish. They defeat Egypt up in Carchemish. Egypt's kind of been reigning for a couple years, like right around the 609 to 605 time, over Judah. Then Babylon comes to wipe them out, and they come all the way, chase them all the way down to Judah, and then they're like, "Oh, there's Judah. We're going to take them over as well." And of course, then later on, Judah is taken over into Babylon in the 3 stages of captivity. So that kind of gets us to what's happening in this area that helps us understand what Habakkuk is going to be talking about. What's happening with these other nations, with Assyria, with Babylon, with Egypt, and how does Judah fit into this whole picture? Is there any comments or questions about that? I hope that was clear. I tried to make it as clear with the arrows and circles as possible, but if there's any questions or comments about it.
I think it's interesting that Josiah, I'm not sure what the background of Pharaoh Necho is as far as his faithfulness and things like that. I don't really know anything about him. But if it is true that he did what he did, went up there to help the Assyrians by something that God had him do, it's interesting that Josiah, also a God-fearing man, made his own choice to go in and do that. And God didn't interfere with that.
Right.
It's very interesting that just shows the level of, even though God has so much incredible power and orchestrates many things and causes many things to happen, he definitely leaves us with a lot of free will.
Yeah, that's a great point, and that is something that Habakkuk covers a decent bit, especially in the first chapter, which we're still going to try to get through today. That he really does hit on this quite a bit, and you'll see that in some of the other prophets like Jonah, where he's a God-fearing man, but the pagan sailors he's with are the ones that cry out to God, and he's sleeping in the boat. Similar ideas through some of the other prophets. And so the time, at this time, the religious and moral kind of situation for Judah is pretty glum. I mean, even with Josiah, his reforms, his good life, the people are really still just cruel and corrupt. Social injustice and moral corruption just abound and appear widespread all over Judah. And just like Israel and Judah have always struggled with, idol worship is just abounding. Like, nothing's really any better than it really has been. Judah is just as bad. So this is the end. This is where Babylon gets to. So we saw the map at the beginning of Assyria. So they're kind of in this whole area, and then Babylon is in this whole area. So they really just take over basically the same general area that Assyria had at their points of power. So that's kind of this is the transition that's happening broad scale over the world, over this part of the world, that gives us a lot of context for what Habakkuk is talking about. So Babylon just replaces Assyria. We'll leave the map alone for now so we can focus a little bit more on the text. Real quickly, the length of Habakkuk is 3 chapters. It's 56 verses. It's actually the 4th shortest book in the Old Testament by the Hebrew word count. Apparently it's 671 words, but it's very short. So hopefully we can cover it in 2 classes. I planned for that. So, but here's one of the really important things for us to remember as far as like this, the purpose of this class for us to have a good understanding of what each of these minor prophets is about is the theme of Habakkuk. So does anyone have like kind of a guess or a ballpark of what the theme is for Habakkuk from the reading or from kind of what we've talked about so far?
All of it is God explaining why he does what he does with the nations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So God explaining why he does what he does. Why does God need to explain that?
Because we want to see things through the human eye.
Right.
So I think maybe the theme might be to live by faith.
Live by faith. And that is one of the key passages that Habakkuk talks about in chapter 2. So what we're describing here is God's explaining. Yeah, go ahead, Thane.
I think another good idea that comes from this is that God only does what is best. Very often the things through which we suffer seem at the moment as horrible or very counterintuitive to what we expect of God's plan. But when we pull ourselves out of the present sufferings, Paul writes about it, I do not believe that the present sufferings compared to the glory to be revealed. Is that we go through these hard times, we see these horrible things happen, but we need to trust that overall this is God steering things to the best end.
Yeah, absolutely right. So I wrote this word on the board because Thane is basically saying exactly what this means. The idea of theodicy, which is a really good word to remember for Habakkuk, because what it is, it's a vindication of divine goodness and providence in the view of the existence of evil. So evil exists, and theodicy is defending God's goodness and existence in the face of, and providence in the face of that evil. So it's a recognition, it's a thinking about how evil exists, and basically the main question, the theme is, how can God be good when evil exists? I won't write that whole thing on the board right now, but how can God be good when evil exists? That's the main question that Habakkuk is wondering. He's kind of perplexed by just what's going on. Like we went through the map and everything that's going on. He doesn't understand what God's telling him and what's going on. So that's his dilemma. How can God be good when there's so much evil in the world? And so if you looked through Habakkuk, how is it unique? Like how is it different than the other prophets? What really stands out about it?
He questions God, but not in a way that's disrespectful. He wants to know why. And that's one of the unique things about Habakkuk that the other prophets don't do.
Mm-hmm.
They're relaying his message, but Habakkuk wants to know, well, why is this? And then also what's unique is that God doesn't rebuke him for his questioning. He simply goes and explains, this is the way it is. Let me help you to understand.
Yeah, I'm really glad you pointed that part of it out about God not rebuking him. Is that the end of class? Do we have another bell? Okay. I couldn't remember. I'm really glad you pointed that out because there's a sense in which this kind of resembles prayer because Habakkuk has dialogue with God. He's asking him questions and God's responding. So instead of taking God's complaints to the people like most of the other prophets do, he's really taking his own complaints and the people's complaints to God, which is a unique thing among the prophets. None of the other ones do this. Did you have something to add to that? Did you have something to add? I thought I saw you raise your hand. Sorry. Okay, so getting into chapter 1, a little slower than I've meant to, but we're getting there, and we've got some time still on Wednesday. It's, like I said, it's a shorter book. So the oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw, chapter 1, verse 1, O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear? Or cry to you violence, and you will not save? Why do you make me see iniquity, and why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me, strife and contention arise, so the law is paralyzed, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted. So chapter 1, verse 1, we have the basic introduction, superscription, who's the prophet, what's going on, he's an oracle of God. And then in verses 2 through 4, we have Habakkuk's first dilemma, his first complaint, which is what? Can somebody summarize, like, what is his question here? What's his dilemma, his complaint?
Why aren't you doing anything?
Exactly. That's very well said. Why does God allow wickedness to go unpunished in Judah? There's so much wickedness going on. Why won't you put a stop to this, God? That's what he's saying. So the question he's asking, especially in verse 2, how long? How long, O Lord? Which this kind of implies that he's been asking, that he's been calling out to God for a long period of time and hasn't gotten any response. Which again kind of goes back to the prayer. Do we sometimes pray to God and we're praying repeatedly for the same thing and we feel like God's not answering? And these two questions, I don't know where the marker, there we go. These two questions, though, I just used it to point. Why and when are big questions in Habakkuk. Why won't God do something? When will God do something? And those are questions that not just unique to Habakkuk. Those are things that have gone through all of humankind's mind, all of God's people's minds for the longest, for all of time. So we have this statement of, how long, O Lord? When are you going to do something? And he wants God to hear him, which is not just like, God hears what I'm saying. It's an answer. It's a reply with action. Actually bringing judgment, justice to this unjust, wicked nation of what's going on. He wants God to respond. And his main problem is violence. That's what's going on. All this violence. Not of the invading power, but of his own people, of Judah. That strife and contention arise, the law is ignored, justice isn't upheld. And so why won't God interfere with judgment? Also, when will God interfere with judgment? Those are kind of the twofold question. And really, one of the things that stands out to me the most for just these first couple verses is the candor with which Habakkuk speaks to God, which we kind of just mentioned a moment ago, that God doesn't really rebuke him for speaking to him this way. I mean, I would be a little afraid to say some of the things. Hey God, why do you idly look at Ron? Why are you sitting there doing nothing when all this is going on? I would be kind of afraid to say that to God. That's exactly what Habakkuk says. And I think there's an element to that God already knows what we're thinking. He already knows what's going on in our minds and hearts. And so Habakkuk really is an example of God already knows what's going on. He already knows what you're thinking, what you're feeling. So why not bring it to him? And then God's response, essentially, is he's going to use the Babylonians to punish Judah's sin. So we're going to mainly cover that next class because we're about out of time. But I really want to open it up to any thoughts, comments, questions about what we've looked at so far. We only got through the first couple verses, and we'll be fine. We've got plenty of time on Wednesday. Todd.
It's interesting that Habakkuk is such an example of respectful boldness. And yet how often are we afraid to boldly go before the throne of God? And he doesn't. But God knows his heart and knows how he's doing that.
Great point. Good end on. One more.